Hi, I'm Greg Ulan with Reynolds & Reynolds, and this is Connected. Today, I'm really excited about this conversation. I get to talk with Sandra Gonzalez. Sandra, you might know as the Fleet Queen. She has just built an amazing fleet business. She's the National Government and Fleet Manager at Peoria Ford out in Peoria, Arizona, kind of the greater Phoenix area. Sandra, thanks so much for joining me today.
Absolutely. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So wanted to start at least to give a little context with kind of what you're doing today and what you've been able to do at Peoria Ford. You've really grown the fleet business at Peoria Ford a ton since you've been there. So how long have you been there? What's that growth looked like? And then I want to circle back around to a few other things, but maybe start there with a little context.
Sure. Yeah, I have been at Peoria Ford since 2019. It's been quite a ride. We started out and we were doing about 600 units a year on the government side of the business. And at this point, last year, I believe we did 1,800 units. So it's been a huge growth. We've gone from basically just having me to having a whole team of people. So it's been a ride, but it's been a lot of growth and a lot of navigating through the challenges that come with exponential growth. So yep. I would say that's kind of where we're at this point.
So how many sales folks do you have on the government side?
On our government side, we've got 4 people now in terms of just sales. And then we also have admin staff and lot attendants. We certainly couldn't do it without any of them. And then we also have drivers that kind of coordinate with all of our upfitters and move vehicles around and then deliver vehicles to our customers. On the commercial side, Peoria has, I believe, 8 other salespeople as well.
Okay, that's great. So maybe give a little background too. I always find it interesting. Everybody's got a story how we ended up in the automotive retail space. So if you don't mind, share maybe yours a little bit, however far back you want to go, or however far back makes sense. But how did you end up, as the fleet queen in Peoria, Arizona?
Sure. So the last thing I thought I was going to be doing was selling cars. That's for sure. I was actually going to school for psychology. Both my parents are psychologists, so I figured may as well just follow in their footsteps. Started out sort of in health and fitness. In college was just a great job to have. Ended up as a personal trainer. And then sort of moving on with my life, I got into real estate and I didn't really love it so much. Somebody that I knew in one of my networking groups said that one of the police upfitters in my market was hiring and they were looking for a salesperson. They knew I had been in sales. So I started in police upfitting, did that for a couple of years. And then I realized pretty quickly that I was much better off selling a turnkey vehicle. So if I sell the vehicle and all of the upfit, that is, that would be the game changer. Around that same time period, I had one of my dealer partners reach out and he basically said he was starting a fleet department at a multi-brand store and he wanted me to come join him. So I went ahead and did that. I moved down there. We had sort of exponential growth, picked up a bunch of contracts. And as soon as that happened, obviously, when you start growing pretty quickly, that the word kind of gets out. And Peoria reached out to me at that point and had asked, do you want to potentially move to a larger market and, help us grow our government team? So I came, checked it out, saw their inventory, saw that it was huge, which is great. Right. You can't sell vehicles if you don't have them. So that was a game changer for me. And I moved out here. And kind of the rest is history. I went to town, hit the ground running, and here we are.
That's awesome. So if you don't mind, share a little bit tactically what that looked like hitting the ground running, right? So a lot of us at some point, automotive's so tight knit, right? There's this group of folks and it seems like, we're all doing the same thing and we'll end up in different places, but we all have a similar path. But, you go to a new place. And as so many people do over the course of their careers, how are you able to really get after it right away? Because I think that's something that a lot of people struggle with is, you mentioned exponential growth, but if you don't get from kind of where you're at now, so 0 to 1, it's really hard to get from 1 to 50. So what did hitting the ground running look like for you?
Well, I think it kind of depends. So there's 2 pieces of this. There's the government side and then there's the commercial fleet side.
Okay.
On the commercial fleet side, I actually attended it's Ken Taylor's commercial truck training program.
Okay.
Uh, that is a phenomenal program. I learned word tracks. I learned how to network, the best ways to network, joining trade associations and getting very involved in those associations. So working with the Home Builders Association on their welcome committee, things like that. And so I would go to all of their meetings, but then I would get firsthand access to every new member. And so I was able to network with those people right away. And eventually that side sort of becomes more of a referral based business. And at this point, pretty much all of my commercial business is referral based.
Yeah.
But networking was huge. In terms of the government side, to be able to grow the government side, you need to really have contracts. And actually, something that I learned when I was in upfitting is that I'm very, very good at reading the fine print in contracts and navigating around them. And so I spent a lot of time acquiring contracts, looking for contracts, reading the language in contracts, and really educating myself. So one of the biggest pieces on both sides is you need to know your product 100% through and through, and also know your competitor's product. So, by educating yourself, you then sort of become this educator versus a salesperson. And I think that's really what set me apart, was that I didn't go into businesses and I didn't go into government agencies asking them for a sale. I've never been like that. I'm actually really terrible at high pressure sales tactics. It's going in and just saying, I want to provide you with some information. I want to be a partner for you. Whenever you have a need for me, please remember me. And that's sort of where the Fleet Queen was born from. I wanted to make sure that there was something that was memorable. So I would collect their contact information and then just basically stay in contact with them. So there's a lot of things that you need to do, but I think ultimately hitting the ground running is making as many contacts as you possibly can and letting other customers be your salespeople. So asking them for referrals. I think it's the most basic of things, but a lot of salespeople do forget to ask for referrals, and it's literally the most basic thing that you could do to gain business.
Yeah. So then how do you scale that? Right. So you mentioned the amount of growth that you've had. I mean, 300x or 3 times, so 300% growth in just a couple short years. And you have more salespeople working for you, and you have a team around you that's helping with a lot of things. Is it a matter of just training them to do those same things, or is it more structured than that? How do you scale? Because you only have so much time. You can only go to so many trade meetings. You can only go to so many events. You can only reach out so much. So as you've grown, how have you scaled so rapidly?
So scaling definitely has everything to do with a team.
Right.
I mean, in terms of scaling, obviously, I ended up actually getting a lot of business very quickly because of taking that educationally based approach. People feel comfortable with it. They don't feel pressured. I am never going to be that person. And so by doing that, I had plenty of leads, but obviously you run out of time very quickly.
Right.
So it was a matter of hiring. I first hired an admin. The admin basically took over most of my paperwork. I was initially ordering all my own vehicles, and then I realized, oh boy, I need somebody else to handle this and navigate all the commodity constraints and such. So I hired somebody to handle, ordering vehicles and managing inventory. And then after that, we had lot people and we have delivery people that we've hired because you can't deliver everything. And most of the time, if it's a retail customer, it's a commercial customer, I typically try to be there at the delivery. On the government side, less so. I do go about once every couple months. I'll go to the delivery, but for the most part, it's my delivery partners that are taking care of that. And then it's following up, obviously, after delivery, making sure that everything went okay, making sure that I don't need to do anything else with that customer to satisfy that order. Scaling has everything to do with infrastructure. And I will tell you this, I scaled way too fast without that advice. So I learned the very hard way what happens when you scale too fast. And it kind of turns into a bit of a nightmare because you're trying to juggle so many things. And so you have to take a step back in order to take a step forward. Very, very steep learning curve there. But that's ultimately what I did. I think in terms of scaling and really branding, I started actually spending money on marketing. And then when I say marketing, I mean social media, advertising, things like that. And then I also send out a monthly newsletter. That newsletter is mostly educationally based. So talking about what we have in inventory, deadlines that may be coming up, manufacturer cutoff dates, things like that, tips for managing your fleet, all kinds of information. So the biggest thing is education, and not necessarily pushing sales, but saying, hey, we've got units on the ground if in fact you do need something. So the newsletter gets a lot of response.
So how did you grow your subscriber list, right? I mean, you're not just blasting out a newsletter. Presumably, these are people that have raised their hand. They've either done business with you or you've made contacts somewhere. But that can be a really difficult thing to do, to get emails to send people to, especially people that want to receive your email, your newsletter, right, and the information you're sending out. So what was your process like to actually create that distribution list for that newsletter? Because I would present that's at least as hard and certainly as important as the content going in it.
For sure. Developing. So initially, my contact list was just the people that I was meeting with, that I was kind of touching on it on a monthly basis, on a yearly basis, whatever. A lot of it was marketing, going to networking events. I spent a lot of time going to trade shows and just trying to collect as much information as I could, because at the end of the day, most of the time when you send out an email, somebody's not going to respond the first time. They're going to respond 3 or 4 or 5 times down the road. And then they're like, oh, wow, I need a vehicle. Now I'm going to reach out. So that was one way. The other way is getting involved with cooperative contracts. So a lot of the co-ops, when you are awarded one of their contracts, they will actually provide you with a member list. And so I was able to utilize those member lists to be able to kind of get in contact and say, hey, we're a member of your cooperative now. We are awarded this contract, and we have units in stock. If you need anything, please reach out. So I just sort of tried to gain the largest sort of footprint as physically possible. One of those ways is to basically work with national cooperatives. So they typically have a much larger customer list. Yeah.
No, that's great. That's great. And then once you have them, as long as you're providing valuable information, clearly they're going to keep taking it, right? I assume, and maybe I'm wrong, but I assume you don't have, a high unsubscribe rate or anything like that, where the information you're sending is highly relevant to the people that you're sending it to. And even if they don't need it right now, it's still pointed towards them and they probably find it valuable.
For sure. And I think COVID has kind of, it shed a lot of light on how marketing should be done and what's effective, I guess, in my mind. Not being able to meet with people in person, I had to find a way to navigate around that. And email newsletters has been one of the number one things that I've been able to do, and it's had an exponential return.
No, that's great. That's great. So I want to shift gears a little bit because I want to talk about, and I want to understand, I guess, first how you function. But so upfitting vehicles, you're going to purchase a vehicle from Ford, and obviously there's a lot of different use cases for any different client that you're going to have. So upfitting the vehicles, do you handle that yourselves at Peoria Ford, or do you partner with an upfitter? Has it always been that way? What does that relationship look like? How do you get a vehicle ready to be sold?
Let's see. So in terms of upfitters, I was just like, oh boy. Okay. So in terms of upfitters, we do not do upfitting at the dealership. So we do outsource that. We have a huge network of upfitters, and those are located all across the US. So sometimes if I say I'm drop shipping to somebody in Ohio, I'm going to get on the phone and I'm going to call one of the upfitters up close to their location, make sure it's somebody that has, a good reputation, and I'm going to reach out to them. If it's something that's basic, and I would say most of the time, people are requesting pretty basic upfitting service bodies, lights, sirens, you name it, pretty basic stuff. If it becomes something that's a little more complex, then I typically bring those things nearby so that I can check the vehicle myself, make sure that everything's there, things like that. But we utilize pretty much our entire upfit network. And that, I mean, those include everybody from, Knapheide, Royal, All Out. I mean, there's so many of them. And we,
Sure.
we, we send the vehicles there and they get their upfit done. Or one of our drivers will go pick it up. They'll bring it back to us and I do an inspection and then we'll run it through detail. And then at that point it's delivered. So pretty
Nice.
straightforward, streamlined process. If it's something that's out of state, it's a little different. It typically will go to the upfitter, and then the upfitter I will partner with them to basically clean it up, fuel it, get it all ready, and then we'll schedule it for transport and delivery.
Okay. Okay, that makes sense. So, with those relationships that you have across the country, do you see? I guess, do you find yourself going back to folks that you've worked with before? It's almost like, your repeat and referral business you were talking about earlier. I assume you have some of those relationships too, especially as you continue to broaden your distribution base across the U.S. Do you find those pockets of folks that you tend to work closely with?
Absolutely, absolutely. I have customers that actually, when I was in New Mexico, have been waiting for me to find a contract in the state of New Mexico so I can sell to them. So that, yeah, absolutely. I have customers that I would love to say are sort of my favorite customers because they always come back and they're very, very loyal. They have helped me grow my business. I've learned from them. A couple of them I actually have done fleet analysis for, where we're sort of looking at their entire fleet as a whole, and figuring out when is the best time for them to replace vehicles versus continuing to fix them. When are they going to get the most monetary value out of their vehicles when they're selling them, things like that. So those customers, though, you really develop a long-term relationship with, and they become sort of like family, and they're friends. We go out to dinner. It's when their wife's birthday is, or when their kids' birthdays are, and they call and they just chit chat with you, and it's nice.
No, that's great. That's great. So as you've grown the business, Phoenix is obviously a large metro, but you're expanding out beyond Phoenix. Clearly, what does your mix look like now, and how long did it take to get there? So local versus national, as far as what your sales look like. If you're doing 1,800 units a year, what percentage of those are the greater Phoenix area, or at least Arizona, and what percentage are further out and across the country?
I would say my best estimate at this point would be about 60% in Arizona and
Okay.
40% across the US. I actually now at this point am not handling any business in the state of Arizona,
Oh
other
wow.
than my commercial customers. So I am primarily focused in New Mexico, California, and Texas. But obviously we have national reach. For whatever reason, Ohio has really picked up the last little while. So we're getting a lot of business out of Ohio, which is great. So, and I know Montana is another big one in the state of Washington as well.
Nice. Are there any things that stand out for markets that are good for fleet business, right? So clearly you have a large fleet business in the Phoenix market. You mentioned a few other pockets. Is there anything that stands out to you? Is it growth? Is that the driver? Like a city that's growing, is that the driver for a market that's good for fleet? Are there other things that play into it? I don't know if you see any trends there.
I would say definitely market growth is huge. The other piece is when a market's not super saturated with dealers that are working in your space, because just because there's dealers there doesn't mean that they're playing in the fleet space at all. So being aware of what dealers exist, who you're competing with, watching, kind of the market. But the other thing that I've found that's great for fleet business is rural markets. So
Okay.
rural markets are typically very underserved. They don't have the resources that we have in big cities. And so they're looking for somebody in a larger city that can provide them good customer service and deliver what they need without having to pay this ridiculous premium because the dealers in their neighborhood want to put a giant markup on them because they're the only ones there.
Right. No, that's interesting. Yeah, just as you continue to expand it, it'll be interesting too to see what your observations are as you continue to grow, right? And I'm sure things will change over time. All right, I want to shift gears a little bit and think less about selling and more about managing fleets and how you encourage your customers to manage their fleets, what that looks like. So maybe even just starting with your relationship, if you have one, with the service department at the store or other local service departments. What does that look like? Do you sell service plans? How does that work for you when it comes to your fleet business?
Sure. I would say this is interesting because in when I was in New Mexico, I didn't do a whole lot on the service side. But I realized, and really, again, it was sort of during COVID when, a lot of vehicles would go down and then there were parts and commodity shortages. And so we couldn't replace those parts. And so a lot of people were like, oh boy, I have to buy a new vehicle. So I realized that there's just this very important piece about partnering with service. And actually, I partnered with service specifically to kind of generate leads as well on the front end. But service, first, having a good contact in service that you can call and say, I have this customer, they need a vehicle picked up, they don't have the ability to bring it in. Can you guys go out and get it and bring it back, figure out what's going on and communicate with me in terms of, what we need to do to resolve these issues? That's been absolutely a game changer. I also try to have service connections in other markets, just in case I have somebody in another market that needs service. But in terms of service plans in general, if a fleet has their own mechanics and they're doing most of their work in-house, I typically am not going to obviously recommend a service plan for them. However, over the life of a vehicle, what I have found is that if you're a larger fleet, Ford offers, fleet extended service plans and maintenance plans. And so you get pretty competitive pricing. When you enroll in one of those programs, everything is covered. And it forces the fleet to actually do the maintenance that they're supposed to do, especially if they don't have an external fleet management company. And at this point with telematics, so telematics obviously is huge. It's coming on every vehicle now. Part of the telematics program, Telematics Essentials, is free to the end user. And then, they have upgraded programs that cover more options that you can't get with the basic program. But I always recommend that the fleets utilize those programs because they're going to give them information on the way that their drivers are driving, when the maintenance is costing them a crazy amount of money, and find that point at which vehicles are costing too much to maintain and you're better off replacing them. I think that's the number one thing that I can recommend to fleets is do an analysis, track your data. I know that sounds like everything we're hearing today, but it's important and there's a reason for it. And the reason is really you want to maximize that dollar because, obviously we know it's not going as far as it used to. So we want to make sure that we're maximizing that dollar every single day. And the other piece, and this is something that nobody really talks about, but you've got to kind of educate your drivers on how to drive. Basic driving school things are they don't cover that hard braking is a problem and it's costing your fleet money. So utilizing those tools, utilizing education, I think is absolutely huge.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Well, and braking is a great example, right? I mean, somebody that's used to driving even an F-150 that now is driving an F-250 or an F-350 with a bunch of stuff on the back of it. It's 2,000 pounds heavier. You can't drive it the same way. It's not good on the vehicle.
Absolutely.
No, that's good. So thinking about, and you mentioned it a minute ago, leveraging service for leads, but thinking about that maintenance and that schedule to, I guess, proactively be in front of these people at the right time. Do you have any strategies for that? Because it's not, I would imagine it's not like you're logging into your equity mining tool and saying, okay, who's probably in market? That's not the same plan. It's much more, I'm sure, mileage driven, time driven. So I don't know. How do you manage that? How do you find those opportunities to make sure that you're in front of those people when the opportunity comes to sell a new vehicle or rotate that fleet?
Well, I honestly try to help fleets plan about 3 years in advance. So we sort of set a point where they're planning to replace vehicles. And so we have a replacement cycle built in. Obviously, there are things that fall outside of those parameters, but for the most part, my advice is if you're going to be selling a vehicle and you're not just going to run it into the ground, you're best off selling that vehicle before it gets to 100,000 miles. That way, you're going to get the most return on your investment. At that point, I generally have a time frame based on, we've already done a fleet analysis. We already know when those vehicles are coming up to be rotated. And we have record of every single vehicle that we've sold. And I've got an idea of when those vehicles are coming up for replacement. So we're reaching out and, hey, you've got these vehicles coming up for replacement. Or I just have that conversation with the customer. Hey, which vehicles do you have that are coming up for replacement? They're having a lot of maintenance issues. Let me know. So sort of let's touch base. And it's just a phone call. It's picking up the phone and saying, hey, what's going on? How are you? How's your fleet doing? Do you have any needs? The nice thing that's helped is that since most of the manufacturers are now going to sort of an order to delivery model versus the, hey, come pick it up on the lot model. Yep. Especially with, floor plan being as expensive as it is right now, more often than not, dealers are opting to have their customers order vehicles. When we're looking at ordered vehicles, it allows us to project a lot better because we have to ask the question about a year in advance. Hey, what vehicles are coming up this year that you're going to need to replace? And we get a heads up on that because we're asking them and being proactive about, what orders do we need to put in now because you need to plan ahead or you're not going to have vehicles. So it's especially regular cabs, they're impossible to find on the ground. They're very challenging. And when people have a limited budget, you definitely don't want to be looking for something on the ground because dealers know that it's just not the plentiful selection that it used to be. So.
Right. That's great. That's great. So do you, when you're working with a customer, even in an ongoing way, do you have them plan or do you recommend a plan for, if you have a fleet of 30 cars, right? Or 30 trucks. So a pretty decent sized fleet, you're going to want to rotate, a third of that every 3 years or every year? Or is there kind of a schedule that you lay out for them so that they can have it in their mind? All right, I'm going to need to do these 10 this year and these 10 next year. Is that logical? Does that track?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think typically it depends on where they're starting from. So if they have a bunch of aged vehicles, unfortunately, we might be replacing all of them very quickly. But in most instances, I would say everybody's got kind of a variety of aged vehicles. So we'll say one is, a year old, another one's 3 years old. My typical rotation, I would say, with the vast majority of my customers is about 3 years. Okay. They're running that vehicle, especially if they're doing an adequate amount of mileage. So they're doing 12 to 15 to 20,000 miles a year. 3 years is pretty substantial. If they're a fleet that just sort of runs around town, the only reason I would recommend replacing something that doesn't have high mileage is idle time. So if there's a lot of vehicles that sit idling all of the time, you want to look at engine hours too. And it's something that a lot of fleet management companies kind of miss. They're just looking at mileage and time frame. But idle time is very important because your engine is still running, Right. Your transmission may not be doing a whole lot, but your engine is running. And so you do still have engine hours on there. And so we do, for people who idle a lot, especially like law enforcement, things like that, it is important to rotate out those vehicles and do so on a consistent schedule because things start breaking. It's just part of the game, But you want to make sure as long as you want to make sure that you're keeping up with your maintenance and doing everything that you possibly can during that time frame so you can get the best life out of them and then turn them when they're still in halfway decent shape.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. All right, I do want to shift again real quick because I love what you've done from a marketing perspective. You mentioned it a little bit earlier, right? We talked about the Fleet Queen and that branding. But to go even a step further, one of the things that I've noticed you do, I've seen it on LinkedIn. I'm sure you do it in other places, probably in your newsletter as well. But you're really good at finding a problem right? And articulating that problem and then offering a solution to it in a way that maybe nobody else has. So one example I saw, and you probably have a million of these, maybe you could share, but one that I saw that I was like, oh, that's a great idea, is you realize that there were a bunch of schools essentially that had funds available for transportation of a 7 to 8 passenger vehicle. Well, the Ford Transit, they stopped making the 7 to 8 passenger version of. So you said, what's a great solution to this problem is the Expedition. It's a comfortable vehicle. It's got 3 rows. It seats 8 or 7, depending on the configuration. If you're interested, let me know. So I thought that was a great way to spin things. And again, you probably have other examples, but I'm curious to hear your thought process on that. How you find those things. If I assume it's intentional, but how you find those things and how you decide to frame them up.
I think it's in that particular scenario, I was getting so many phone calls from school districts and I didn't have a solution for them. And I was sort of in a panic. What are we going to do? And I spend a lot of time meditating. And meditation just sort of allows me to get clear answers on things, because when I'm hustle mode all the time, you definitely don't have a clear mind to find solutions about things. So one day I was doing my workout in the morning and I was thinking to myself, well, how the heck do we move 8 to 10 people? What vehicles do we have that might offer that solution? What am I going to do for these schools? Because there's they have to spend this money before the end of the fiscal year. What are we going to do? And I realized the Expedition holds 8 people. Why would I not think of that? So I actually made that post. It was very, very interesting because sometimes the response you think you're going to get is not what you end up getting. And coincidentally enough, I had an upfitter reach out, and he informed me that there are aftermarket upfitters that recertify transits now. And they will take a 12 passenger van and they will make it into a 8 or 10 passenger van and recertify it so that it can be insured. And I was literally just, mind just blown. I was like, why did I know about this?
Right.
And that's sort of how it goes when things transition and there's, 20 things transitioning at the same time. And you've got all new models. You're trying to learn the new models. And it's like, oh, well, they got rid of the 8 and 10 passenger vans. And at the time, I really wasn't super focused on schools. I was more focused on the law enforcement and fire market. And so I really didn't think about it. But then when this came up, I was like, oh, boy, we need a solution. So, I try to find those problems and put them out there because either you're going to get a huge response from customers or you're going to learn something. And when you say something that no one else is saying, or ask a question that no one else is asking, typically somebody can offer you insight into how to solve that problem if you haven't found a solution on your own. So that's sort of why I put it out there.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. So to build off of that too, I love what you've done, kind of niching down into this fleet market from the Fleet Queen, but also even your URL, governmentautosales.com. That's in and of itself a really smart move to be able to have your place in the market, right? It's not, Peoria Fleet Sales. That's not what it is, right? You're really focused, certainly in that URL, in government sales. So talk to me a little bit about your thought process there too, and how, and maybe you just do it naturally and it's inherent to you, but you seem like a pretty deliberate person, a thoughtful person. So I'm guessing there's some logic behind, why you chose these things.
Yeah. So we actually had a team member on our team that had brought that to our attention and basically said, I think this is a good idea. I think this is something that would help. And the part of this that was really important was we had scaled to a huge level. When you scale outside of your resources, I would say, and you get to the point where you have to take a step back, you start looking for solutions to fill in those problems. And so what we were doing at that point was starting to develop a customer relationship management software. And when we did that, we needed to have a server to host it on. So we were sort of like, okay, what server are we going to host it on? And so that's kind of how Government Auto Sales was born. And so all of our fleet management and CRM stuff goes into our CRM that's located on that server. And then we also utilize that domain to give our government customers a look at our inventory. So they can basically see at any given time what vehicles we have on order that are coming in soon and what vehicles we have on the ground. So I send that out in my newsletter every month, and they can go right to that government auto sales website. And it's actually inv.governmentautosales, it's just inventory. And they can take a look at that. And that actually makes my life easier because then I can just pull up a window sticker and say, okay, here you go. Here's your quote. And they know exactly what they're getting. So that's kind of how that came up. So I would love to claim responsibility for it, but that one, unfortunately, was not me.
Well, that's why you put a great team around yourself, right? You know, that scale comes from great people. So that's actually a great story that folks around you were able to think that way too. It says a lot to how you've kind of brought them on and picked your folks and helped boost them up as well. Well, I want to be super respectful of your time. I know you probably got some trucks to sell, but I wanted to talk a little bit too, if you don't mind. You mentioned, your morning workout and you were a fitness instructor for a while in a past life. But I am curious, what does that look like for you? Because I think there's a ton of people out there. We're in a very busy industry, right? And every day there's more stuff to do than you're going to be able to get done. But I think most people have at least a desire to be physically active and fit in some way, shape, or form, but there's just not time to do it. So how do you balance that? How do you make time? How do you create time in your day, week, month to to be able to fit that in, to be a part of who you are?
So it's a kind of a loaded question because I learned that also the hard way. The first 4 years I was in the business, I kind of was 100% work. I would work late nights. I would spend 24 hours a day. Sometimes I would literally work through the night and I'd still be working in the morning. And, my husband would come in and be like, what are you doing? But I loved what I did. And so I just wanted to keep growing and keep growing. And I just had this drive to keep growing. And during that time, I sort of ignored my health. I had some symptoms come up that I sort of ignored. And eventually that became what I was spending all of my time on, was fixing my health. So I ended up with toxic mold poisoning 2 years ago. And during that time, I started having some issues with my short-term memory. And that is a big problem when you are working and juggling so many different deals. And it took about a year to figure out what was going on. Turns out we had mold behind our kitchen sink, which we had no idea was behind the cabinet. So who's looking back there? And then we live in Arizona. Who the heck has mold in Arizona? So this was something I ended up spending all my time on. So at this point, it's making health and wellness a priority. It has to. It's a non-negotiable. I get up every morning. I work out. I spend some time meditating. And I make sleep a huge priority. It would probably surprise people that at this point I go to bed at 9:00 and I am out. I have a 6-year-old, so I've got to juggle that too. And health has to be your priority, because if you don't have your health, you have nothing. And you don't function clearly. You can't juggle things the way that you think you can. And when things become overwhelming and out of control, it just means you have to hire more people. And I think sometimes we want to be able to do everything ourselves, but as much as we want to think we're superheroes, it's not a thing. We are fallible, and we definitely need to take care of our health. So, clean diet. I get up during the day when I'm at work and I go walk around the lot. I actually have a couple coworkers that walk with me, and we'll do just a couple laps around the block just to get up, get the blood flowing, help your brain operate a little bit better. And obviously make sure to stay hydrated. So, it seems like the most basic of things, but it has to be a priority, because you are not sustainable if you don't take a time to breathe. And you have to take vacations. And I see vacations at this point as health and wellness, because I didn't take any vacations when I first started in this industry. And I was just hustle mode all the time. You have to take vacations. You have to take a moment. You have to shut it off, and you have to have somebody to be able to cover for you. So that's the long and short of it. But you want to take care of your health before it ends up being the only thing that you're taking care of. So
yeah, it's a great perspective. Great perspective. Thanks for sharing. Well, Sandra, what else you want to touch on today that we haven't had a chance to? Anything else top of mind for you that we haven't hit on that you want to?
I think the biggest thing is just for people to know that they can ask their dealer to help them on a deeper level than most people do. I think a lot of the time we see a dealership as just sort of a sales and service location. We don't, most fleets don't want to utilize the breadth of the services that we actually offer. We can offer every piece of fleet management that exists. You have to have a well-seasoned dealer and somebody who's willing to take the time to sit down with you and do that fleet analysis. And especially when you're growing, there are incentives that exist for fleets that have grown substantially. And a lot of times, the fleets don't ask those questions because no one's informed them. Hey, we can get you a custom discount from the manufacturer if you have a certain size fleet. So ask those questions. Ask about, incentivized financing that might exist, or ask about tax incentives that exist in your particular market. Each state has different, offerings in terms of tax incentives with vehicle savings. And I'm not sure that every state has them, but a lot of the states have, incentives when you lease a vehicle through your business, things like that. So just ask the questions and make sure that the dealer that you're working with kind of knows what they're doing from start to finish. It's important, and it will save you a lot of money on fleet management costs if you do it, because we do it just sort of as a courtesy. So.
Great. That's good. Good piece to take away. So, Sandra, thank you very much for joining me. It was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. So, Sandra Gonzalez, the Fleet Queen, National Government and Fleet Manager at Peoria, Arizona. Hopefully, we'll talk again soon.
Awesome. Sounds great. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, that was a fun conversation with Sandra Gonzalez. She does a great job there at Peoria Ford. Obviously, she's grown that business exponentially. Exciting to watch her kind of grow that business and her team as she goes along. I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. Don't forget, before we hop off, you can watch or listen to all episodes of Connected on YouTube, Apple, and Spotify podcasts. And make sure to hit subscribe so you're notified every other week when new episodes are released. We'll see you in 2 weeks.